Hello, everyone, and welcome. Like what Virginie said, I am an ICTJ US Fellow in addition to a restorative justice practitioner. We are going to open up with an ancestral land acknowledgement. And in this moment, I really invite us to think about our breath and also to think about what has brought us all to this space. I think it is really beautiful that we have the ability to have these conversations to really transform our communities, in addition to transform hearts and minds. And so I invite you to sit in a comfortable position, whatever that looks like for you. I invite you to close your eyes if you feel called to do so. And you can also keep them open. And I just invite you to take a deep inhale. And on the exhale, I invite you to sigh and exhale. Acknowledge the power of your breath. Inhale. And exhale a sigh. And as you continue to breathe in this moment, I speak to those who first lived on these lands, who continue to live and cultivate this land. Its sacred powers, its majestic beauty. I see you. In this moment, I speak to those descendants who were enslaved on this land, who cultivated this land, who built families and communities, those who thrived and triumphed. I see you. I acknowledge your presence. And as we've moved through this moment of COVID-19 and devastation all across places like Ukraine, Palestine, I want to acknowledge those who continue to live and those who continue to fight and those who have also transitioned. I see you. I acknowledge you. And I know that we also bring our stories to this space and the legacies that follow us. I see you. I acknowledge you. And I just invite you to take another inhale. See that breath as a ring of light moving through your body, giving gratitude to what it can do. Invite a deep sigh. Don't feel rushed to open your eyes. You can open them slowly, maybe blinking a few times. Ashe, and thank you all for that. And I will pass it back over to Virginie.
Thank you very much, Jodie, for helping us open thoughtfully and being fully present in this moment. So to those of you who've just joined, I want to welcome you again on behalf of the International Center for Transitional Justice to the launch of this new report titled Civil Society-Led Truth-Seeking Initiatives, Expanding Opportunities for Acknowledgement and Redress. So what we want to do today is, really open a space to share reflections, both past and present, on truth-seeking efforts that have been led and driven by civil society groups across the United States and globally. This report was initially written several years ago, and I want to give a special shout out to Lisa Magarel, who's joining us, for the incredible work that she did at ICTJ, really laying the groundwork for this work and providing support to truth-seeking efforts globally and, very importantly, here in the United States. So thank you, Lisa, for being here with us today. For those of you who are not familiar, the ICTJ is a nonprofit organization. Our headquarters are in New York. We have offices around the world. And our mission is to really support civil society groups, victims groups, and governments that are looking to face and deal with legacies of mass atrocity. We have a program now in the United States, and this report and this event is part of our efforts to really uplift the work that's being done around the United States to address legacies of racial injustice here and provide a space to share challenges, experiences, and strategies. So with that, I want to turn it over to two of the co-authors of this report, Eduardo González and Jill Williams. And I'm not going to give their full bios, but put the full bios are in the chat so you can read all about them. So without any further ado, I turn it over to you, Eduardo and Jill, to talk us through sort of the main findings of this report.
Thank you, Virginie. Jill, I think that we are going to start sharing these few slides that summarize some of the findings that we make in the report. Okay. So anyway, I would like to just say a few words and let Jill talk about some of the conclusions that we put in this document. The first thing is to recognize, in fact, that there was something going on in 2014 or 2015 when we first started discussing about the need for a report like this, meaning that we recognized that civil society-based truth commissions were a thing happening in the terrain. It was already 2014, after the killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson, that a group of colleagues led by Dave Ragland, who is in the call today, launched a truth-telling project in Missouri. At the same time, we realized there was a Black Women Truth and Reconciliation Commission being launched in Brooklyn, New York. And we realized that this was happening all over the place. And just looking around the world, we saw that there were also initiatives coming from civil society in places where normally a typical transitional justice practitioner would say that there were no conditions for a truth commission. And so we questioned the idea that a commission or a truth-telling project coming from below would not be a real commission. We realized that transitional justice can come from below and can be community-led. So that was the motivation. And we were able to look into documents that existed before, people who had been working on this, and I want to emphasize the work of Lisa Magarel in ICTJ, and also Louis Bickford, who wrote many, many years ago something called Unofficial Truth Projects, which precisely called the attention of the transitional justice field on this issue. So Lisa and Louis were pioneering this kind of thinking. What we did was to call colleagues in different parts of the world and find out whether they were seeing the same trend, and they did. Originally, we identified no less than 10 or 11 cases around the world, but we had to choose and synthesize. And the document you are going to read has just 4 case studies. But even that can give you an idea of the diversity of what we call truth-telling projects in the local communities. These are projects that emerge without the support of the state in any form. These are not supported by a municipality or by a local legislature or by the national government at all. These are initiatives that emerge precisely when civil society realizes that there is not enough political will in the state to comply with the rights of victims, or else when civil society decides that they want to create a precedent, that they want to set the field for the state to comply with its obligations. And so this is what we have seen. Jill, if you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you so much. And one thing that we found, for example, is that, yes, what truth-seeking projects do at the local level is exactly what truth commissions, official truth commissions, are supposed to do. They establish the facts, what has happened. They fight for the rights of victims, ensure that victims have the space and the capacity to intervene in the public sphere. and they inform policy, meaning they make specific recommendations. This is not truth for truth's sake. This is truth for the sake of social change at the local sphere. Next, Jill, please. And something that we thought after reviewing all these elements and the fact that these truth commissions were emerging all over the place was, yes, this is important. Yes, this clarifies many facts, many aspects that have been disputed in local communities and in the national community at large. But that doesn't mean that the state can say, this is all right, we don't have anything to do now. Because what communities are doing with their truth-telling is actually to demand the state to comply with its international obligations and with its constitutional national obligations, recognizing that victims have rights and a right to redress that includes the truth, reparation, justice, and guarantees of non-recurrence. What happens when communities create truth-telling projects from below is that they are adding to what we used to call the toolbox of transitional justice elements. You don't have to wait until the state is ready, until the political parties are ready to launch a project, right? The Ardoin community in Northern Ireland did basically an oral history report interviewing about 100 families of people who lost their lives during the troubles in that particular community. The women in Colombia launched the Women's Truth Commission way before the actual negotiations for peace between the FARC and the Colombian government to inform precisely what was going to happen, the kind of transitional justice agreement that would take place later. And North Carolina's Greensboro TRC, which was created by the local community without support, sometimes with the hostility of the local authorities, not only had an impact in the community of Greensboro, but has served as an inspiration to locally launched transitional justice initiatives all over the United States. There are about 50 locally created initiatives on truth-seeking, on reparation, on racial justice right now around the country. And all of those, in my experience, look at Greensboro as an inspirational and initial moment. So that is what we did in this document. And what we want is to put the document at the disposal of those who are going to use it, meaning the communities that feel that they have to move forward, even if the local authorities or the national authorities at large are not providing the leadership that is necessary to support victims' rights. Jill, I don't know what points you are going to emphasize next.
So first I want to say it's so great to see so many of you here. I appreciate so many folks who I invited coming from various projects around the country. I want to say that the best part of this report is what we're not going to go into depth on here, which are the case studies. There's no one size fits all process that's going to work in every community. But what I think is the most interesting are the stories about how different communities have gone about the work. The report highlights some of those stories in a set of considerations. We were intentional about not saying that some things are best practices because this is a creative process, but we did come up with a list of 12 considerations for before, during, and after the conclusion of a civil society-led truth-seeking initiative. I'm going to talk about 3, maybe 4 here, but the report, I encourage you to go and read the report to get the full list. The first consideration, and you'll see on the screen that I've listed all of them, but I've highlighted the ones I'm going to talk about. The first consideration I want to talk about today is the question of who initiates or convenes a process. And on this point, I think it's really necessary to distinguish between who is invited to the proverbial table and who sets that table. And there's no right or wrong answer to who should be setting that table, but I think it goes back to what your primary truth-seeking goals are when you think about who should be setting the table. If your truth-seeking goal is to uncover a truth that is still unknown or unverified, then one thing we found through our case studies is that it might be useful to invite people to set the table who are connected to that information you need. So in Greensboro, for example, and that's the example I know the best because I was the executive director of the Truth Commission there, we needed to get buy-in from the police and from white supremacists. We can talk later about how we did that, if there's any interest in that, and Joyce is here on the call and she can talk about that too. But that meant that we really had to figure out who needed to be setting the table in a way that we maximized the chances that police and white supremacists would feel comfortable coming and sharing information. But sometimes the goal is not to uncover truths that we don't know. Sometimes it can be to raise awareness and create visibility around truths that are known but are silenced. And in a case like this, which would be like the Colombians Women's Initiative that we talk about in the report, you might want to focus more on having different survivor or victims groups setting the table. In order to empower or embolden victims or survivors to come forward. We also find that that can help to heal historic rifts between these groups that we know tend to exist because of the oppression that has taken place. A final example, the Scotland Poverty Truth Commission, there's the fact of poverty was not in dispute there. And the experiences, it's not like these stories were even silenced or unspoken there necessarily, but the goal there was really to empower those harmed by poverty to become effective stakeholders in building new policies. So there, what we saw was that the Church of Scotland had a lot of legitimacy with all the stakeholders that needed to be at the table for that, and they served as an effective convener of that process. Next question I want to talk about is the scope of inquiry. For my folks here who are in Maine, the way we talk about this often is coming back to the question, what is the what? In official processes, the scope of inquiry is often negotiated carefully by opposing parties, and it often tends to be a fairly narrow scope of inquiry, usually focusing on violations of civil and political rights for a fairly narrow group of victims. But in a bottom-up civil society-led initiative, it's not always, it's an opportunity and a good thing to some degree that it's not always that narrow. When we're looking at systemic racism, colonialism, oppression, truth with the capital T involves intertwining social, economic, political, cultural, and civil rights violations and how they interact. And on the one hand, we want people to understand these things and how their personal stories connect to them. On the other hand, that level of detail can be overwhelming and can feel overly academic. And so it gets us away from the particularities of people's lived experiences. So we find that we don't have any magic guidance on exactly how to find that balance, but more so lift up the idea that you need to find a balance. I would also say the geographic parameters of a truth-seeking initiative are a challenge and an opportunity. These stories tend to be national, if not international in scope, but it's really too easy for people on the ground to dismiss the national or international inquiries as not relevant in their particular communities. So in Greensboro, what we found were that there were plenty of people there. Most everybody was comfortable talking about racism and slavery and Alabama or Mississippi, but there were a lot of people who didn't want to talk about the Greensboro Massacre. When I lived in New York City, people were very comfortable talking about the Greensboro Massacre and all the racists in North Carolina, but they didn't want to talk about stop and frisk policies or about gentrification. So really grounding these stories in local communities, I find is important. I currently live in a very, very red community in the Appalachian Mountains. Opposition to critical race theory here is as high as it is anywhere. But the local truth-seeking project we're working on here, and there's some people here from that project, we've actually gotten zero pushback to our truth-seeking efforts here. I think that's because a lot of the local opposition to critical race theory is based on this notion that the lessons and those theories are being imposed from Richmond or they're being imposed from Washington, D.C., and they're not relevant to us here. So since we're starting talking about history very locally, we don't have those challenges. And so I think there's great value in grounding these conversations in local communities as much as possible. And I know that Joyce and the Johnsons can talk a lot about that as well. I hope she'll get into that. The next consideration I want to talk about is, the role of victims or survivors in the process. The Traditional truth commissions tend to be victim-centered, which means that they consult with victims groups, document victims' experiences, and otherwise encourage compliance with victims' rights in their operations and recommendations. But the roles of victims or survivors in civil society-led initiatives can be much more central. One challenge with having victims or survivors initiate a process is that it can be accused of bias. I think I'm running out of time, so I think Joyce can probably talk really well about how the process in Greensboro addressed this. A new point I want to make on this topic, however, that was not in the report, but that I've encountered recently is that I've worked with lots of white-led organizations that are not engaging in racial justice work. And part of the reason that they often give is that there are they can't find organizations led by people of color to step up to partner with them in that work. And that's understandable, but it's also kind of a weird way of blaming victims for their own continued oppression, to say, well, we can't possibly do this work if people of color don't step up to partner or to lead it with us. And I'd argue that civil society truth-seeking also offers an opportunity for white-led organizations to dig into their own histories and learn from and speak about those truths without having to wait around for other organizations, particularly those led by people of color, to take the lead or to partner to make it happen. Truth-seeking work is an ongoing process. A white-led organization might look into its own complicity with racist systems as a way to help build trust with those other partners in work. So the last point I was going to talk about, but I think I will leave for the discussion, is creating legitimacy. The brilliance of the Greensboro process, I can say because I wasn't involved at this point, was the selection process, the robust democratic selection process that they created to engage everybody in the community really could have a role and see themselves in seating the commission to give it legitimacy. I encourage you to go and look at that. You can read about it in the report. But I really think that that is a useful model for all organizations to look at. So with that, let me stop sharing and hand it back over to Virginie.
Great. Thank you so much, Jill and Eduardo, for sort of highlighting some of the main points in the report. And we'll drop again the link in the chat, and it's on our website. So I encourage you all to take a look where these questions are discussed in much more depth. And now for the next part of our program, what we want to do is have a roundtable discussion focused on the cases that are examined in the report, as well as a more sort of dedicated focus on the Greensboro Truth Commission and the Commission in Elaine, Arkansas, with Jodie and Joyce speaking to those. So before we turn to the discussion, for those of you who may not be as familiar with these different contexts, we want to show you a brief video from each. So we'll first show a video from Greensboro and then from Elaine, and then we'll launch into the discussion. So Evan, if you can go ahead and share the videos, please. And while he gets those queued up, after the discussion, we'll also have a chance to go into breakout groups. So I want to preview that. All right, over to you. Thank you. We don't hear the sound. If you could make sure to share sound as well. Thank you for your patience. There we go. So now we'll first have the video from Greensboro and then from Elaine, and then a chance to discuss this a bit more, and then some questions. So Evan, if you're ready, you can go ahead.
On a bright November morning in 1979, the sound of gunshots and shouting pierced the fall air of Greensboro, North Carolina.
Evan, we're not seeing the screen. Sorry, if you could just show the screen.
We were organizing textile workers, and in 1979, that was still an uphill struggle. And we were having a major rally to promote that work. What we wasn't aware of is that the Greensboro police had put together a racist united front for the specific purpose of coming to disrupt the march. Klan and Nazis took weapons out of the trunk of their cars and fired into that group of people gathering for a march. Jim Waller was shot in the back and killed. Cesar Causé was shot in the chest and killed. William Sampson
All right,
Let me know if you all can hear the sound when I go ahead.
great.
Share this as well. Can you all see the screen?
Yep.
Yeah.
Can you
Perfect.
see the images? Okay.
Yes.
Thank
On a
you.
bright November morning in 1979, the sound of gunshots and shouting pierced the fall air of Greensboro, North Carolina.
we were organizing textile workers. And in 1979, that was still an uphill struggle. And we were having a major rally to promote that work. What we wasn't aware of is that the Greensboro police had put together a racist united front for the specific purpose of coming to disrupt the march. Klan and Nazis took weapons out of the trunk of their cars and fired into that group of people gathering for a march. Jim Waller was shot in the back and killed. Cesar Causé was shot in the chest and killed. William Sampson was shot in the face. Sandy Smith was shot in the head and killed. And Michael Nathan was shot in the face as he was trying to render service to William Sampson. And all of this was videotaped, and the shots were pretty clear on the television.
In spite of this blatant act of violence, 2 subsequent criminal trials acquitted the shooters of any wrongdoing.
What does it take to confuse and frighten a community to the extent that it actually denies what it saw with its eyes?
In an effort to help the Greensboro community heal, Nelson and Joyce Johnson began work to form a local Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 1999. It was modeled on a similar one that shaped post-apartheid South Africa.
It said, in effect, that we are dedicated to carrying out a truth process with the intent of actually promoting forgiveness and healing.
Greensboro became an open classroom as citizens took part in hearings, town hall meetings, and petition drives. The Johnsons brought labor, women's, civic, and religious groups to the table to improve the lives of those affected. They brought former Nazis and Klansmen face to face with relatives of their victims, helping both to release long-held pain.
I believe that the hope of our city is not to run from its yesterdays, but to face its yesterdays, so that the yesterdays will not be its tomorrows.
For the extraordinary contributions they're making in their encore careers, Nelson and Joyce Johnson win the 2008 Purpose Prize.
I'm going to go ahead and cue up the other video. As I'm doing that, I want to acknowledge, that these stories are real, and that it's also heavy. And so as you're watching and listening to the video, take the time that you need and don't forget to breathe. After this next video, we're going to do a collective breath together before sharing some reflections. And I'm going to go ahead and share another video that particularly speaks to Elaine, Arkansas.
Elaine, Arkansas's Main Street consists of shelves of shuttered storefronts, some with dusty items still on display.
Just a little old country town. We barely do have a store.
The town's history gives this vacant scenery some haunting context. 100 years ago in Elaine, white mobs massacred hundreds of Black men, women, and children in one of the bloodiest racial confrontations in America's history.
People still don't talk about it. A lot of people got killed and really wasn't nobody brought to justice. You know, they own land, they had to run off and leave it, you know, because they were scared.
It began on a late September evening in 1919. A group of Black sharecroppers were meeting just north of Elaine to demand better pay for their cotton crops. But a deputy sheriff and security officer, both white, showed up and fighting erupted. The security officer was killed. What followed was what's known as the Elaine Massacre. Mobs of white men flooded into the town, killing an estimated 200 Black people. 5 white people lost their lives. Hundreds of Black people were also arrested and jailed. The massacre was a part of dozens of race riots and confrontations that broke out across the U.S. from late spring to early autumn in 1919. It was known as Red Summer because of the severe racial bloodshed.
It used to be a couple of
James White was born in Elaine. His grandmother told him stories of how Black residents hid in swamps to escape the violence. Now he is the director of the Elaine Legacy Center, an organization that's focused on preserving the town's civil rights history. Narratives about the violence in Elaine differ. Researcher Brian Mitchell has been trying to sort through them.
Everybody that had some degree of power in the state or in this county was a part of the process of the massacre. So the people who would control all the records are actively suppressing the records.
But some are trying to change that as the 100th anniversary approaches in September.
For so long, the Elaine Massacre was not really acknowledged, or it was something that was talked about behind closed doors.
Kyle Miller and others, including some white descendants of those who participated in the violence, want recognition of the massacre in a region where there are still many who doubt the severity of the bloodshed. A large, swooping concrete monument is under construction across from the Phillips County Courthouse in Helena, about a half hour from Elaine. But not everyone supports the effort. Some residents in Elaine are angry the memorial is being built outside their town.
If you said 1919, what do you think of? Elaine. It should have been in Elaine.
Those behind the monument defend its placement, saying the massacre was bigger than the small, relatively inaccessible town of Elaine.
It was really more of a strategic thing than anything. We wanted something that people would be able to easily find and locate.
But members of the Elaine Legacy Center say building a monument misses the mark and that any commemoration must focus on the land taken from Black people. They are demanding repayment and reparations for what was lost during the massacre. For White, the tension is a modern-day version of the power struggles that were at play in 1919 between wealthy landowners and the poor Black residents of Elaine.
100 years later, it's the same old stuff, just a different day. A lot of it. It's the same old game, just a different day.
Noreen Nasser, The Associated Press, Elaine, Arkansas.
Friends would walk up to me and just be like, "What the f is in your mug?"
Thank you all for that. I'll share just a few words about Elaine, and then I'll pass it over to Reverend Joyce Johnson, which I'm so excited to. I was saying earlier as we got on a few minutes that it felt like we were in person, although I know that we're virtual, and I just feel the warmth and just where we are in the work. I think each of these communities is so critically important to what it means to tell the truth and what it really means to transform community and to transform systems. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to be a commissioner in Elaine, Arkansas. And before that, I had not heard about Elaine as well as many other people And this was through the Proctor Conference. And I know that there's some Proctor folks on this call, and I always speak about their work. And one of the things that comes up for me is the value of radical hospitality. Thinking about what Jill and Eduardo were sharing earlier, it is not just about the process itself, but the container that we create that's safe enough and brave enough for folks to share and tell those stories, ones they've experienced, but also stories that have been passed down. And how does that then lead to community transformation? And Proctor created this sacred, and it's a part of their sacred memory work, they created this sacred space where you had people who were identified as witnesses and commissioners. And then it was really beautiful to see so many other people in the audience step forward, right? Because it was the first time that they were hearing these stories being told from others that they had been in community with. And so how even their bravery inspired others to speak about the impact of the Elaine Massacre on them, but also to share the full story, the narrative of the loss of life and dignity of particularly Black residents, right? That in the historical context, it's really downplayed to maybe a few handful of people who were violated, but we're talking about hundreds of people who were killed over this series of a few days. And so when I think about the Elaine, Arkansas, and their role, even in this, what is seen as a civil rights movement, for me, a part of my goal when we asked the witnesses what they wanted us to do, one gentleman said, go and tell everybody about Elaine. And so I could be talking about ice cream and I might start talking about Elaine because this legacy and this history is so incredibly important. And as we hold spaces for telling the truth and repair, making sure that these processes aren't simply symbolic, but they really create an opening for transformation that happens on a systemic level, but also transformation that I believe happens on a spiritual level and from a place of healing. And I speak clearly as someone who went to undergrad and stayed behind in Greensboro, North Carolina. I know that is the work of Joyce Johnson because I've seen it happen, right? How they've inspired, honestly, the whole state to engage in a different way. And so there's more I can say, but I'm going to go ahead and just pass it over to you to kind of share a little bit, about your work as well as the commission.
Well, thank you so much, Jodie, and thanks to everyone, particularly to Jill and Eduardo for giving us that overview, that framing, which is so important, in this period when there's so very much falsehood and misrepresentation and deception that dominates our whole cultural, social, economic existence. Having someone, some persons come together and frame things in truth, frame things in a manner that speaks of justice, of appreciating the dignity, the worth of each and every person on this earth, those here and those who've gone on before, is so valuable. We just need that. And that's part of my thought about what truth processes are for us. And thank you for those who put together the two videos that did help give us some grounding. And just to say, Jill, thanks for the prompts. You gave me about 10 questions to answer, so I'm not going to try to do that in these few minutes. But in 1979 and then the years after that, those of us who were much younger, 40 plus years younger, but we were the young, what people call activists, the organizers, who were fighting hard for social justice. Some like myself and my husband, who's preparing for another call. You might have seen him in the background here. We're so committed to changing what we experience as young African Americans. And we grew to understand that it wasn't just African Americans, but certainly our Native American brothers and sisters. And then poor whites, I have to admit, we weren't even fully conscious of our Latino brothers and sisters. We probably just saw them as Blacks, as we were. But all of the diverse people who are not reaching their fullest potential because of the systemic injustices in our country. So we as young people can do the gift of young people, set about to change that. And in the course of that, we came up against some of the deep, deep resistance in this country and beyond, as we're seeing in Ukraine and other places today. Deep resistance to really the well-being of the world's people. 5 people were killed, 10 were injured, including my husband, and our neighborhood terrorized. You saw a bit of that on that video. But beyond that, the scars were deep within. I still shed tears about what we endured, and I link those with what my ancestors have been experienced. And then today, I feel it so much when things like George Floyd, Michael Brown, you know, the young women we've been hearing about being killed. All of that's part of the same pattern of abuse and repression of people for me. There's not a real separation. But you have 2 choices when things happen. You can mainly continue to be a victim, or you can really take your own liberation and that of other people into your own hands. You won't be able to do it by yourself, but you can at least do the part you can do. That's what we did with the truth process. We had tried the courts. We finally, after 3 trials, got a modicum of success with a settlement. And with that meager settlement, $351,000, we actually formed the Greensboro Justice Fund that we mainly use to help other processes in the South. Not so much the truth processes, but just fights for justice. So the courts basically failed us. The media failed us miserably. We were painted as these horrible people from nowhere. Though by that time I had lived, I think our children were 7 and 8, so I had lived here for 10 years, married, working, you know, paying taxes, doing all those things, but fighting for justice. And many other people were involved right here in town. So we had to tell our own story. And for a while, even the institutions like the churches, the charitable organizations, all those failed us. But because we took a stand and said, there has to be justice for the people who were killed, people need to know our story, then that made all the difference in the world. So for those of you who are considering a truth process, I commend it to you. It's not a panacea. There are problems with it and all of that. And Jill and Eduardo have talked about some of that. But it does a few key things. It gives you a voice. It gives you a voice. That is important. And I will be forever thankful to the Archbishop Tutu and members of that South African Truth Commission who emphasize that to us, that the victims, the survivors, those most impacted must speak. We need the academicians to bring in the analysis. We need political analysts, all of that. But the voices of those most oppressed need to be heard. They need to be heard by those who are not among them, but we need to hear our own voices because sometimes we don't even, we've learned to be silent. Think about how many Jewish families have said their grandparents for a while would not talk to them about the Holocaust. There's something that happens in these oppressions that silences you, but really the strength comes from our own voices and the history of what we have experienced. And also the solutions to what we are seeking to correct. Who knows better than those who are impoverished in this country how to stretch a dollar? I've heard so many times, we've got to teach people how to manage their money. Well, if they're still living in this country with the underpaid situation, they know how to manage money pretty well. Certainly there's some things everybody could learn, but we have to acknowledge that there's a wealth of knowledge, understanding, possibility among those who are oppressed. But beyond that, we've been taught, some of us, that the truth shall set you free. That is true. That is true. But not only will it set you free, it will set others free, because if you're hooked to a false narrative, if your whole life is built on these senses of, say in our situation, white supremacy, the supremacy of persons who might be of the male gender over other genders, the supremacy of people who have at an educational level or whatever like that, those are falsehoods. all people are created equal and are endowed by their creator certain inalienable rights. Heard that before? Well, I have to believe that. But more than just believing it, I'm prepared to push for it, to make it real. All my life, as I was a young girl in Richmond, Virginia, fighting for that. And so we have to believe those truths and then push for them. That's what a truth process happens. But the last thing I want to say about a truth process, again, I think Jill alluded to it. It really has to be embraced as a community-wide effort, even those who might oppose it, because the falsehoods are coming from all around. They even reside in us. Those of us who are of color, those of us who are women, have had to grapple with the self-deprivation, the self-hatred that will come as we hear the falsehoods about ourselves. So you have to fight for yourself. I'll be forever indebted to James Brown. I'm Black and I'm proud. You know, that just sounds like a song to you now, but in the 60s, that was significant to be able to say, yeah, I'm Black and it's a good thing. Or yeah, I'm poor, but it's like, I don't have to stay there if I can really bring about some justice. So, but the community piece, and Jill, I think part of what made the difference in Greensboro is that because we were organizers, we are still organizers, and we're able to keep the community engaged even when there were all these pressures coming against us, and that's where we still stand. So I'll just wrap up by saying, given where we are today, we had no real choices in the 90s, which was really several years after 79. We just kept going back through this old falsehood, catching us as we were trying to do this good work. We realized, given where we are today, that the lessons we learned, the experience we gained, the strength we gained from going through the Greensboro truth process has not only been helpful to others, Eduardo, around the country, but also has emboldened us to now stretch out to try to put forth a statewide truth, justice. We added that word, and reconciliation process. We feel that we can do it in North Carolina the same way that Greensboro inspired others to do likewise. We are hoping, pushing, praying that that will happen in our country, because our country needs it dearly. And we are willing to be that model, that inspiration, to give some hope. So many people are pretty hopeless today. I don't care what income level you are. When there's one wave of COVID after another, when you're seeing the pictures from the Ukraine, when you're seeing the rollbacks in the Supreme Court, when you're seeing all the disruption in our schools, our young people committing suicide more and more, that's a lack of hope. And if nothing else, our Greensboro process and our continued standing, I think that's why the creator of the earth, for me, God, has given Nelson and me at age 75, and he'll be 79 next week, the strength to continue is to serve as that source of hope and possibility. That is what is really essentially human, and that makes the possibility for us. South Africa gave it to us. We got it from Eduardo knows in Peru. So we're prepared to do our piece in Greensboro to give that hope to the world, and just have an example that if we did it with almost no money, the government against us, they voted against this process. But still we were able to pull it off because we were linked to the people. So I just hope that those of us in this country will be able to join hands, go over the hardships, but know that the hope resides within people, but we've got to be linked up to one another. And that's what Greensboro showed. That's what we're now trying to show from the state of North Carolina, and looking forward to a better future. I've got some beautiful grandchildren I'll tell y'all about one day. And we need to build a better world for all of them. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Joyce, for those remarks and inspiration. Really appreciate that. I think before we go into breakout groups, I wanted to ask the four of you just for your reflections. We had a lot of questions, but we'll have more time to discuss that in the small groups. But one bigger question, as people sort of weigh the decision over whether to pursue truth-seeking through government-led, officially supported processes or community-led, could you all take a moment just to share some thoughts under what conditions you think a civil society-led truth-seeking process might be a more promising strategy than a top-down government-led process?
Well, do you want us to go randomly? How do you want us to?
Yeah, if you want to go ahead and start, and then we can go. Thank you.
When you asked that question, I thought about something that Alex Bahrain shared, who's one of the founding members or the founding member of ICTJ, I recall. When we went to South Africa at the invitation of the Archbishop and Nelson Mandela, who, by the way, weren't there when we got there, Jill, remember? They were over here at some other activity. But we met with Alex Bahrain, and he pretty much convinced us that what we had done in Greensboro, which we felt a little bit that we hadn't achieved our goal to have the government, our city government to embrace this process and really support it financially and other kind of ways, but institute the findings. He said, what you have might be a superior method, and I'm going to begin recommending it to others, because what you had to do was really go to these very people we were just talking about. And the people changed their understanding, their commitment, and then the people fought for progress. So it took us, some of you may know, 40 years to get a formal apology, which is, I think, a decent apology. Could have been better, of course, from our city, because we would not stop. We had changes in education. We've had changes in the wage level for people in this city. All those things have been by continued work of the people. So I think ideally still would be a hybrid, where the government would be actively involved and the policy implementation comes more clearly. But it gets back to that thing about, unless the voices and the will of the people is central, it will not go forward in a way that is fundamentally transformative.
And I can just share a very brief story from Greensboro that drives that point home. And that was, at some point, as Joyce alluded to, we had folks in Greensboro who took a petition to the Greensboro City Council and asked them to endorse the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They ended up not only not endorsing it, but the motion that was made and that carried along racial lines was to oppose truth and reconciliation, not just the commission, but truth and reconciliation completely. All the white members voted to oppose, the Black members were supportive of the commission. And I honestly, naively thought that might really harm us when that happened. I thought it might sacrifice some of the legitimacy that we had built up. But what we found was that it really didn't hurt us in most quarters. And it in fact helped us with some people, with younger people, particularly younger people in African-American communities, who said, look, you're investigating. If the city had signed on to it, they might not. I think they were more skeptical that it was actually seeking truth because of the distrust of the city, because of the distrust of the Greensboro Police Department. Their opposition lent more legitimacy to the process for a lot of people. So like Joyce said, ideally it's a hybrid. You're working towards that. But I think when you have such a high level of distrust, a civil society-led initiative can be a good start.
Thank you. Eduardo, any reflections you want to give in response to that question?
No, honestly, I would like to go to the working groups in view of the time.
Great. Okay. Jodie, did you have any reflections on that? If not, you can explain, or you can take a moment to answer that question and then explain the breakout groups.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree with each of that. I think on some level, we have to approach it as community organizers, right? Yes, we bring our hearts, but also what's the organizing lens we can approach it with. And one of the things I think about is, if this is a community that folks live in and they want to hold any sort of process, really still surveying the community, right? Just because we live in a community doesn't mean we know everything about it, right? There are often these hidden pieces that I think many people discover once they start building and moving towards a commission, right? So for some rural communities, the process will look different and the groundwork will look different, right? Maybe versus some larger cities like New York, where people are thinking about how do we tell the story, right? Of so many communities that have been impacted by things like gentrification, for example. So really taking the time as you're building the process, because I think often we see the process and might not think deeply about the work that it took people. Sometimes it literally is just going around and knocking on doors for a year just to build relationships where people trust you enough, because safety is really critically important. What happens when there are stories and truths that are told that have been suppressed, right? How does that impact folks who have to continue to live in the community, and how do we continue to keep those stories alive? So I think on one hand, making sure we're approaching it from a community organizing lens, that from a place of ego, this is not about shame, but from a place of ego, I might really want to commission, I might really want to process, but is it the right time? And how do I do the work to create fertile ground for it to not just be about the process, but really the transformation that will happen? And like I said, I think, the work of Beloved Community Center and the Commission has really done that, right? Because it wasn't simply about the process, but continuing to fertilize the ground all across the state, right? To make way for these shifts and changes. So I really wanted to add that. So with that being said, we are actually going to engage in breakout groups. Really want to create space for you all, just to engage with each other and ask some questions and really get to know each other. We'll have about 15 minutes in the breakout groups. Whenever we'll keep track of time and you'll see it broadcasted and pop up on your screen. So right now I'm actually dropping a link into the chat. Don't feel like you have to capture every single thing that you're discussing in your group. This is not a homework assignment, but we really want to capture some of the things that are coming up. So 2 questions that we're asking is, do you see a need for truth seeking in your community? Why or why not? And if so, what are some of the anticipated challenges in launching that? So do you see a need, and identifying the challenges? So those 2 questions are invitations. I'll also acknowledge that if other things arise, we would love for you to put that inside of these notes. We will be sharing other resources as we follow up with you. So you might also offer some things here, and we might have resources to be able to support that. So I just dropped the link in the chat, and we're just asking you to connect with each other and engage with these 2 questions, but also acknowledging that other things may arise. And we also invite those into the space. So we'll have about 4 to 5 people in each breakout group as I'm pulling them up on the screen. And if you need any help, there will be an Ask Help button at the bottom of your screen. Does that sound good? Do we have any questions before we move into breakout groups? All right, we're going to go ahead and create those right now.
Excellent. Well, as we close, we wanted to sort of come back together and take a moment to see if there are some reflections you all wanted to share or some questions. I know it's, at least in the group that I was in, we talked about how this is not just a report launch, but hopefully the launch of this conversation, the launch of a support network around truth seeking, and that if we can keep these spaces going, which ICTJ is very happy to keep hosting, that there's a way to kind of continually come together to share challenges and strategies. So again, knowing there's never enough time to discuss the depth of what we're dealing with, want to open the floor if there's any reflections or questions that you'd like to share with the group before we close out.
Well, I was in the best breakout group, and I wanted you to know that I certainly endorse that we do this again in the very near future, just to, even though my breakout group was wonderful, I would like to meet some of the other folks and things. And the only way to do this is to continue and maybe do this again, and so we can have some more dialogue. Dialogue is therapeutic for me, so I appreciate this opportunity.
I would like to say I would like to continue the groups as well. I had good discussion and learned or reinforced what I already knew. You need many heads and many minds to think through this process and to get this work done. And it was refreshing to talk with someone who's from the outside of the United States to get a viewpoint, because that can help us who are in the trenches open up our eyes that sometimes we're so immersed that we don't see things quite as clearly, but we need an opinion from an outside. And we talked about how as a foreign person, you can be bold and you can maintain distance, which is not possible for us who live here and who are in the midst of it. And I speak as a person living in Minneapolis, Minnesota. That's where I live and that's where I do my work. So you all know the context that I'm in.
Oh, yes.
Thank you for that, Pamela. Any other comments or reflections someone would like to share? Jodie, any thoughts from the groups that you were in?
I was in a group with Pamela and and Kay. One of the things I think I'll name is that as I was looking at the notes, I know that folks, it seemed like we're really also talking about healing as a part of the process. And I think it's important that folks are speaking about that because reparations is really popular, which I think we need all forms of reparation, cut a check, spiritual healing, I believe in it all. And how when we're on the journey of the process, I even saw a group ask a question about working with mediation centers and working with healers. We are working on a guide that will support folks who are thinking about processes. And that's one of the things we've been naming, what does it mean to be in partnership with others? And I hope that your discussions, I hope also brought some fruitful possibilities for partnerships, because I think that's what's going to lead us to not just change in our local communities, but on larger systemic levels. So I appreciate folks really thinking about healing as well.
Thank you, Jodie. Any other reflections or questions? And then I'll give a chance for Jill, Eduardo, Joyce to give any final words before we close.
Hello.
Yes, Eduardo, do you want to make any final closing words? I know you're in transit.
I am in a taxi, and what you heard was a street vendor offering ice cream. But no, look, this is a fantastic opportunity, and it's so nice also at a personal level to be able to cooperate with ICTJ again on a document that was in the works such a long time ago. But I think that what is important is a sense of historical opportunity that we have in front of us. In my break room, we had Meadow Dibble talking about the fact that in Maine, in spite of the difficulties of the political environment, they want to mainstream truth-seeking as a mechanism, as a methodology in the Permanent Commission on the status of racial justice and indigenous communities. Joyce Johnson was talking about how Joyce is not only working on the memory of Greensboro, but she's working on a Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission project for North Carolina as a state. So this is an idea whose time has come. That is the message. That will require time, even though the moment is this, it requires to honor and to respect the processes of local communities. These cannot be precipitous processes. They have to be intentional, and they have to mature in the way that each community wants to make them mature. I think that is what I take from this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eduardo, direct from Peru. Joyce, do you have any closing remarks or reflections that you'd like to share with us all, please?
Well, I just appreciate, as I always do, Eduardo's input. This has been a wonderful opportunity, and I appreciate I'm trying to see your name now, but from Minnesota. We have a church member here who's from Minnesota, and she reminds us of things in Minnesota a lot. But let us continue to stay connected. We need each other's support. We don't have time to be together every day because we're working in the particular vineyards that we're called to work in right now. But we do need to remain in touch with one another so that we can learn from each other. And that's a role that ICTJ has played over the years that we value so much. So Jill and Eduardo in particular, thank you. Thank you. I've had the opportunity to read this document when other people probably had, but it was very valuable to us as well. So let's continue and not grow weary in well-doing.
Thank you so much, Joyce. Jill, any closing words from you, please?
I'll just echo what Joyce said. I think so often we think about, and the general public thinks about reconciliation as pulling together people on really opposite sides of issues. But I think we too often get pitted against each other in these efforts. And to use Joyce and Nelson Johnson's terms, I would say, let's keep walking towards each other, not let us get pitted against each other because we have different ideas, but to see those as strengths. And so, Virginie, I hope you can pull us all together again. That would be great. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Jill. Yes, and I think that's something we'd be happy to do as ICTJ. Now I'll just turn it back to you, Jodie, for a quick closing.
Thank you all so much. And just a reminder to go forth and share these stories with others, right? It doesn't have to be a part of the work, but just how do we continue to make these things visible? And so for our closing, I just want to provide a reminder of the sacredness of every single one of us. And so I'm going to be reading a piece by Adrienne Marie Brown called Radical Gratitude Spell that I carry with me constantly. And so she writes, "This is a spell to cast upon meeting a stranger, comrade, or friend working for social and or environmental justice and liberation. You are a miracle walking. I greet you with wonder. In a world which seeks to own your imagination and your joy, you have chosen to be free. Every day as a practice. I can never know the struggles you went through to get here, but I know you have swum upstream, and at times it has been lonely. I want you to know I honor the choices you made in solitude, and I honor the work you have done to belong. I honor your commitment to that which is greater than yourself and your journey, to love the particular container of life that is you. You are enough. Your work is enough. You are needed. Your work is sacred. You are here, and I am grateful." Ashe.
Ashe.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we will be following up with you all, sharing resources, as well as maybe an evaluation. Everything that we've shared during the call today will also be shared with you. And we look forward to just connecting and continuing to build a larger network as we do this work or as we go on this journey together. So thank you all again.
Thanks so much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Jodie, for that beautiful closing.